Can you describe what it was like when you got engaged?
Yeah, so I got engaged while I was at work, my novel, The Engagements, funny enough. I think because as a fiction writer, you're often writing a particular novel, not because you necessarily know what you want to say on a given topic, but because you have questions yourself and you write your way to the answer, if that makes sense, or at least that's how I approach fiction. So I was writing this book, The Engagements, which is about marriage over the course of the 20th century and how it changed in some very fundamental ways and stayed the same in others. And of course, I was at that time in a long-term relationship and sort of just trying to get my head around marriage and what I thought about it. And the other piece of this book turned out to be about the diamond engagement ring industry and how that came to be something that we want. So I did so much research into that and into the advertising behind it that by the time I got engaged and sort of knew that that was in the air, I told my now husband I definitely did not want a diamond ring because I just felt I knew everything about how the sausage got made and I wasn't interested. I decided that I would wear a sapphire ring instead. And the ring that I ended up with, which is beautiful, it does have little diamonds on either side because the jeweler, I guess, had said, it's really not an engagement ring unless there are diamonds, which of course is part of this whole advertising thing. And it's very funny because I'm sure we'll get into this as we go, but Frances Garrity, who was the woman who wrote the famous line, "A diamond is forever," is a character in my book. And there are these sort of secret company memos that are quoted in the book. Those are from real memos, which I looked for 2 years everywhere. I was told they were at the Smithsonian, Boston University, here, there, and everywhere. Couldn't find them. And the day the book was due to my publisher, I had pretty much finished it, and I had resigned myself to not having the memos, which was frustrating because I am a journalist. My background is in journalism, and I was frustrated that I hadn't gotten that piece of the puzzle. But that day, I was going to Frances Garrity's house. She passed away long before I started the book, but I was going to meet the woman who bought the house from her and just kind of be in the space that she had occupied. And we had this lovely chat. And as I was leaving, the woman said, when Frances moved out, she left all of these work papers and I never did anything with them. So if you'd like them, you can have them. And they were actually all these secret memos that I'd been looking for years. They were at Frances's house. And so I was very excited, of course. And when I left there that night, I did not wait to get home. I just went to the closest parking lot, which was like a Trader Joe's parking lot. And I was underneath a street light. And the first memo I opened to was from the 50s. And Frances had written it. And it said, I had just gotten engaged at this point. And the memo said, some girls, especially the ones who've been to college, are going to think that they're just too smart for a diamond ring. So let's try to sell them a sapphire flanked with diamonds on either side. And I look down at my finger and I just think, okay, Frances, you got me. I love it. I felt it was like a little mess from her to me, just sort of laughing.
I'm Tim O'Brien. In this episode of the Shaping Opinion podcast, we're joined by Courtney Sullivan. She's a New York Times best-selling author of novels The Engagements, Maine, The Commencement, and most recently, Saints for All Occasions. In this episode, our conversation will center on a subject that was integral to the story behind her novel The Engagements. The premise of our podcast is simple. We talk about the people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Today we're going to talk with Courtney about how diamonds found their way into the center of America's romantic tradition. How did you become a writer, and what drew you to the subjects that you cover in your stories?
I always wrote stories. Even as a little kid, that was sort of my favorite thing to do, was to write short stories and plays and poems. And they were always very much about kind of the lives, the unseen lives of the people I knew, my family, my friends. And I think that's still very much what drives me as a fiction writer. I also am a journalist. I worked at the New York Times for 4 years as a researcher and writing many articles there as well. And I've written for many magazines and newspapers. And so for me, when I'm writing a novel, which is the bulk of the work I do, it's very much informed always by research. The two very much play off of each other. There are a lot of fiction writers who don't like to do research because they feel that it kind of inhibits them. But for me, the more I learn about the real world of the story, the more creative ideas I get. And so like with this book, the more I learned about diamonds and how the business worked, the more sort of scenes I could imagine developing in a story. So that's, I think, sort of how the two go together for me.
So now I guess we get into the part of the story, and we will get to those things that you talked about. But I wanted to get some background, and I know you've written about this and you know about it, but in the late 1800s, that's where things sort of begin in the modern era for the diamond trade. And that is when we understand that massive diamond mines were discovered in South Africa, and the markets were flooded with diamonds. That reduced their value and their scarcity. And the British men who operated those South African mines realized they had to create scarcity to preserve their appeal and their value. So they stockpiled diamonds and they sold them strategically. And they created this South Africa cartel called De Beers Consolidated Mines. That was 1888. This cartel controlled all facets of the diamond trade for decades. And the chairman of De Beers was Sir Ernest Oppenheimer, and he cultivated a network of wholesalers around the world. So that's the background on this. But you came at this subject from a whole different perspective. And if you could just give us some background before we talk about De Beers and before we talk about diamonds. Can you tell us, Courtney, how you became interested in this subject as part of your own work as a novelist?
So as I said, I started off with wanting to write about marriage. And, I guess sort of on a big picture level, I wanted to look at how marriage has changed. And I wanted to look at how all these big picture things actually affect individual couples and individual lives. And as I was writing, I felt more and more that there was something missing from the book. And what was missing was a more critical eye on this whole issue of the diamond ring and where it came from and why all these people were so crazy for it. And so I did start doing a lot of research into the diamond industry and stumbled upon this very fascinating story about the advertising that's part of it, and the advertising that makes us think and has made people think for almost a century, not quite, but almost, that this is something that's always been with us. It's not really the case.
So you discovered this background on the diamond, and you made Frances Garrity a part of the story. How did you do that?
Well, I knew that I was going to talk about this sort of advertising piece. And once I knew that, I decided that I wanted to have a character who was behind the advertising. And so I started writing it, and the character was a man because the advertising started in the late 1930s. And I guess I was thinking that it must have been a man who was writing the ads at that time. Very sexist of me, actually, because eventually through my research, I was reading a wonderful nonfiction book called The Heartless Stone by Tom Zollner. And in that book, there was just one little short paragraph that said, the line, "A diamond is forever," was written by a woman named Frances Garrity, and that she herself had never married. And, for me, I write news stories and I also write fiction, and the two very much inform one another. So when I read this little factual piece of information that the woman who wrote this line in 1943 herself never married, it really set off a whole chain of imaginative questions and thoughts about why that was, and how that, how sort of funny that was, that the person who made us kind of fall in love with the romanticism of diamonds herself never had one.
That's very ironic. Do you know more about her life story beyond her work at Air, and maybe why she never got married?
Yeah, I did a lot of research into her life, and she was an only child, Irish immigrant parents, and to some degree she was sort of responsible for them until they died. She also, it's sort of amazing to think about because her parents lived on a farm in Pennsylvania, and she spent much of her free time there. And they were raising goats and they were raising dogs and doing all kinds of things. And, meanwhile, she's going into this high-powered city job in Philadelphia and many days New York City. And people in her office life, I spoke to many of her former coworkers, they didn't know anything about her. She was very private. And there were all kinds of rumors about what her life was like on the outside. But no one knew that she was like going to the family farm and doing that every weekend. I think a big part of her story, though, was that she really loved her job, and she was a career woman at a time where you really had to choose. Did you want your career, or did you want to be married and have a family? There really wasn't the option of doing both. And so marriage was not really on her radar. And there's another woman in the story, in the novel and in the real life story, named Dorothy Dignam, who was her predecessor writing the campaign and ended up a publicist on the campaign. Dorothy was writing ad copy during World War I. So, women were in that business for a very long time. I think the show Mad Men kind of gives us the idea that the 60s were the beginning of women in advertising, but it's really not the case. But women were there, they just weren't exactly valued. The idea that Frances wrote De Beers, even though it was one of the agency's biggest clients, it wasn't given to her because she was respected. It was given to her because anytime there was what was considered a woman's product, they felt that only a woman could figure out how to sell that. And so they always gave it to a woman. And when she applied, actually, they said, "Oh, your timing is perfect. We've just lost a lady copywriter." So, they just were kind of slotting in one for another.
It kind of reminds me of what newspapers used to do around the same time. They used to hire female journalists or reporters to cover the society pages.
Yes, absolutely.
And they used, there's sort of a sweet revenge on Frances's part, because not only did she fill what might be considered a token project for a client, but she ended up becoming probably the most revered copywriter with one of the most revered copywriting taglines ever.
She did. And it's funny because, in the context of her work life, it really didn't come to fruition. But it was only a few weeks before she died that Advertising Age named "A Diamond is Forever" the slogan of the century in 1999. And I just love that. And I hope that she knew it. I think she must have known it. But, yes, she was also honored at this wonderful ceremony in London long after she retired. And that's all in the book. And a lovely story in the book, which is true, is that Frances was, among many other parts of her life where she was quite pioneering, she was the first female member of Marion Golf Club, which was a very big deal. No one was ever allowed to join without a husband until Frances. And it was important to her to join because that was where a lot of the business was happening. But it's also where she spent many days in her retirement, and she ended up playing bridge with the wives of all her former coworkers. And so when she was going to London, she was telling them, "I don't really have anything fancy." And they all gave her their best jewelry to wear, to borrow, because they said without her, they wouldn't have really probably gotten it anyway. So that was kind of lovely, I thought.
Was she wearing their diamonds?
Yes, she was. Yeah.
I'm going to provide a little bit of background now that led up to some of this, and I'd be definitely interested in your thoughts. We know that De Beers had a problem with the price of diamonds and for demand for diamonds. So in 1938, that is actually when, in the middle of the Great Depression, that they hired N.W. Ayer, a Philadelphia ad agency. And at that time, the price of diamonds was falling around the world. And you kind of mentioned this, but just to recap, the perception of diamonds at that time, N.W. Ayer conducted research, and they found out that the perception of diamonds was that diamonds were a luxury only for the wealthy and very few. And what Ayer found was that they would have to target across demographics, and that the strategy for them would have to be to link diamonds to something emotional. And they needed to find a way to discourage people from reselling those diamonds. And this is kind of where Frances comes in, because after they did this research, they decided that there were certain values that they could tie diamonds to, and those values would be emotional. They needed to create the idea that diamonds were socially valuable and eternal. That's what they learned from their research. So their conclusion was to tie diamonds to love and marriage. So long before Frances came up with that slogan, she was already writing copy along the lines of that diamonds have a socially valuable and eternal quality to them. Can you tell us a little bit about Frances's work and N.W. Ayer's work on positioning diamonds as something that's socially valuable and eternal?
A big part of this campaign, as you say, was really about connecting to people's emotions, because really no one needs an engagement ring. No one needs a diamond. When, this campaign was very much a balance of the writing, the ads, the visuals, but also really deep psychological profiling they were doing all the time, and surveys of what people wanted. And they found when they first took the project on that women in America said they would much rather put that money toward a new washing machine or a car, something practical. And so they realized, okay, there's not really a need for this product, so we're going to have to play on emotion. And this campaign is very much credited with being the first to ever do this. And it's really a very common thing now and has been ever since. But you'll notice, for example, that even the tagline, they're not really selling you anything. They're not saying this is the fastest car, or this is the soap that smells the best. They're just saying a diamond is forever. And there's something about that that you get to fill in the story yourself. Timelessness was a huge part of it. And the idea was kind of, that if you buy this object, your love will live forever. And the sort of unspoken, I guess, inverse of that being, if you don't buy this, who knows? It sort of was like this insurance policy against love dying. And that was very powerful. It worked very well. And the other thing was that they sold it saying that this was a tradition. They used the word tradition a lot. It really wasn't a tradition for your average person, but it just worked very well. In 1951, they conducted a survey. They did it every year, but that year was the first time that they said, jewelers now say a girl is not engaged unless she has a diamond ring. And that same year, 80% of American women got a diamond, or 80% of American brides. And that number has really stayed relatively consistent ever since. And if you think about it, if you are talking to someone and they say they got engaged, the first thing people always say is, let me see the ring.
One of the things that I looked at when I read up on this, Ayer in the early days, this is a quote, in one of their documents, they said they wanted to create a situation where almost every person pledging a marriage feels compelled to require a diamond engagement ring. And before this is around World War II, before the idea of the engagement ring was widely adopted, only 10% of those rings contain diamonds. But as you mentioned, after that, a diamond ring was just a requirement. So the agency, and here's part of their strategy too, they targeted men at first to create the idea that if they were going to prove their love to the woman they wanted to marry, they had to use a diamond, and that the size of that diamond was very important. Then they targeted women to tell them to expect that if a man really loves you, he would give you a diamond. And their strategy, I thought, was pretty interesting because they started with celebrities. They started with movie stars and other celebrities. They used stories, photos, newspaper and magazine articles, and they really highlighted, probably through the gossip media, the role of the diamond in these various relationships. So before we use the term bling, bling became a very important thing, wasn't it?
Absolutely. And, that idea of sort of capitalizing on Hollywood was also something that this campaign kind of was one of the first to do. And of course, it still goes on today. I mean, it's really amazing. When I was reading all of this research for the book, I would see it pop up in my everyday life. I'd be reading Us Weekly, and there's a whole page of actresses and their diamond rings. And, to us, it just kind of, you'd never think, oh, it's just sort of an advertisement. De Beers was very clever because they were not allowed to mention De Beers in any of this advertising because they had a monopoly and because they violated antitrust laws in the U.S. But you'll notice, the ads are just advertising diamonds. And of course, having the monopoly, any diamond purchase, whether it was from Tiffany's or Winston's or wherever, was money in the pocket of De Beers. And so they weren't promoting the brand, they were promoting the idea more than anything else. And certainly the celebrity aspect, which really became Dorothy Dignam's job, very much putting these diamonds in movies, in magazines, it's amazing when you go through old newspapers. Dorothy actually wrote a column that was syndicated under the name Diamond Dignam, and she would write about what celebrities were doing. But really, every one of these columns mentioned diamonds at least 3 times or something. And it's amazing to think that this woman who was a publicist for a diamond company was allowed to write a column that was placed in newspaper. It's just sort of funny. We do the same things now, but it's a little more subtle.
Times were much different then. One thing that you mentioned, and I know that when I've worked with people in advertising and marketing, the terms they often use, this actually becomes a great debate in most brainstorming sessions, and that is, are we going to advertise or market a product, or are we going to market the category?
Yeah.
And the big debate is, if you spend your marketing dollars on a category, you're basically helping your competitors. So you don't want to waste your money helping promote a general category. You want to promote your own product. But when you have a monopoly, by promoting the category, you are promoting your product. And that's obviously what De Beers knew.
Right, exactly.
In 1946, the agency started sending out these alerts. And then fashion designers were targeted as well. They actually played a big role in making diamonds a part of the romantic landscape. And that is because they were not only targeted to incorporate them in their designs, but they actually became brand ambassadors, weren't they? They would actually do radio and newspaper interviews talking about the role diamonds played in fashion.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And also, and this still goes on, that, jewelers, they, every year there's sort of a competition to see who can create the most gorgeous new diamond configuration. And that, of course, is all, any promotion for diamonds is going right back to De Beers. Although they finally did sort of break down this monopoly to some degree in recent years. And now you actually see De Beers storefronts for the first time in history. You'll actually see a De Beers store. First time I saw one, I was really shocked because I thought, well, how is that possible? But it's a whole new world now, and they're in business with Louis Vuitton, and they're a new thing. But that's only a few years old.
They now have competition, so they're no longer a monopoly. So I guess it's okay now.
Yes.
One thing that I thought was interesting too, and this goes back to the beginnings that have lasted till today, and that is when they showed all these celebrity sightings with diamonds, they said that the goal was simple. They wanted the grocer's wife and the mechanic's sweetheart to say, I wish I had what she has. So they really played upon a strategy of envy and imitation. And that was where Frances Garrity really came in, isn't it? She came in, she wrote those De Beers ads from 1943 to 1970. So really, when we talk about diamonds, we're talking about, and all of diamonds marketing, we're really talking about Frances Garrity, aren't we?
Absolutely. I mean, her fingerprints are all over it. And in a way, it's really amazing because she had written in a letter that when she was young, she wanted to be the great American novelist. And I think in a way she actually was, because she created this whole fiction around what diamonds mean. And she was so convincing, and yet she herself didn't want one and didn't have one. So I always find that kind of amusing.
It is. That leads us to the pinnacle moment. And I'd like to know if you could tell us the story of how Frances Garrity came up with the line, "A diamond is forever."
It's a great story, especially for those of us who are procrastinators. I think when you're a novelist and you write about a real person, I certainly felt that especially because Frances had never been written about before and wasn't a celebrity or something, that I really wanted to be as accurate as possible and write her story as it really happened. But I think there's something that happens when you're a writer and you're spending so much time with a subject and you kind of fall in love with that person and you feel, that in many ways this person is similar to you. And so Frances, certainly, we both come from big Irish Catholic families, extended families, and small Irish Catholic immediate families. She was up late one night and working on her De Beers stuff and about to go to bed, and then remembered that she had been asked to write a little tagline for these ads. And she really had forgotten all about it because it wasn't something that was presented as a huge deal. But her boss was going to South Africa, which is where all the meetings took place, because De Beers wasn't allowed to come into the U.S. So she needed something fast, and the meeting was the next morning. So as she recalled later, she just kind of jotted something down on a piece of paper and then went to bed. And the next morning when she woke up, she looked at what she had written, and what she had written was "A diamond is forever." And she said, that night, as she was trying to come up with something, she actually said out loud, "Dear God, send me a line." And when she woke up and saw what she'd written, she said she thought it was okay. And a few hours later, she presented it at a meeting, and her recollection was, quote, "Nobody jumped." That's what she said. And in fact, there was a whole argument that happened where they talked about whether this was even grammatically correct. And ultimately, her boss said, it's fine. It's kind of a placeholder. We'll use it for now. And of course, it ends up being the tagline, one of the longest running taglines of any brand in history.
It was. When Ad Age published their list of the top slogans from the 20th century, "A diamond is forever" was number one. And just for perspective, number two was Nike's "Just Do It."
Yeah.
So this is really, and the power of a tagline sold so many diamonds and changed the way we look at diamonds and the way we look at love and marriage. Can you comment on why you think that slogan has stood the test of time?
Yeah, and I think, it's funny because that you mentioned "Just Do It," because I think they actually have a lot in common, where the first reaction you have is, wow, that's really powerful. But then it's like, well, what does that even actually mean? And you imbue it with your own meaning. So "A diamond is forever" has been a perfect line for every decade that it's been used. In the early decades, it was a very traditional thing, and the artwork in the ads was very beautiful, very traditional paintings, happy couples. But as things went forward, in the late 60s, the picture that you'd see in the ad would be a photograph of two hippies in long flowing white cotton in a field full of daisies, and there'd be a goat or something. I kid you not. And, it would say something like, "My church may be a meadow, but blah, blah, blah." And it would always end with "A diamond is forever." In the 80s, you'd have these pictures of, there's one I remember with a couple, they're on a motorcycle and they're all like wearing black leather. And it says something like, he knew I love rock and roll, so he rolled out a magnificent rock or something like that. Ridiculous. So, I mean, but then a diamond is forever at the end. So what they were trying to say and did very successfully was, hey, we're with you. We know times have changed. We know things always change. But one thing that doesn't change is you still need that diamond ring. You can get married barefoot in a meadow, but you better still have a diamond ring. And people really responded to it, which is quite amazing. I think now it's interesting. If you ever see any TV ads for De Beers these days, now they're running into the issue of a lot of young people don't want to get married. And so now these ads are saying, hey, that's totally cool. As long as this relationship lasts, that's great. But, you should probably still have this diamond ring. It doesn't have to represent marriage, but it just represents power of your love.
When you look at a diamond, Courtney, what do you think of?
It's funny because when the book came out, I went on a book tour, of course, and I had just gotten married. It was ridiculous. I got married the same week the book was published, which if anyone out there is publishing a book, don't get married the same week that you published it. It's a bad idea, very bad idea. But I ended up going on this book tour right after I got married, and everywhere I went, women wanted to tell me the stories of their own diamonds. And I loved that. And some of them were such fantastic stories that I felt like a little bit frustrated. Like I had to write this book to hear that story, but I wish I could have included it in the book. And I guess it sort of led me right back to the genesis of the story, which was, that every one of these rings that I was looking at in the store with my friend had a story, had a past. I personally love jewelry that has a past. And, I guess there's something, I'm maybe a little bit woo-woo, but I can I have a feeling about jewelry. Like I can say, oh, I think this had a happy life. I want to wear this. Or no, that's one time my husband gave me a necklace and I was just like, you know what? Nope, something bad happened. But I think the reason they endure is that they sort of tell the story to you of where the relationship began, what happened. And I think a lot of people are very drawn to family rings, that sort of thing. I think about like Kate Middleton wearing Princess Diana's ring. And on the one hand, I think it's very beautiful. And on the other hand, I think, but that first marriage was so dreadful. Why would you want to wear the ring from that marriage? So for me, it's very much an emotional thing, and that the emotion of that story kind of stays in the ring, if that makes sense. And so I think that was very much what I was writing about in this book, was that each of these couples, whether they know it or not, is sort of influenced by the other couples who came before, who had this ring play a role in their story.
J. Courtney Sullivan, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Make sure to check out our show notes for more information on everything that we talked about today. You'll find a complete bio on our guest, J. Courtney Sullivan, and you'll get links to more information on America's love affair with diamonds and the marketing that made that happen. You can also listen to other episodes. And don't miss our next episode. You can subscribe to the Shaping Opinion podcast in many ways, and they're all free and easy to find at iTunes and at shapingopinion.com. This is where we talk about the people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Until next time, I'm Tim O'Brien.